Ephesians 6, 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And that's where we're going to focus today. As we talked last week, fathers also includes mothers. There's a definite emphasis on the father, but it's also inclusive of the mothers as well. And it's focusing, first of all, there's the first command that we talked about extensively last week. Do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. New American Standard says this way, Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I touched on this briefly, this word of rather, or this word of but last week. Because to me, it is a great transition word. And as I was reading more into that this week, one of the things I discovered is that in the Greek, the command structure of give a command, and then you have this word, alla, A-L-L-A, and then another command. Basically, well, let me just read it to you this way. This verse has two commands, and the sentence structure is, don't do this, but do that instead. And in the Greek, the way that works is it's the important thing goes first, and the more important thing goes second. And so it's as if what Paul is saying here is this. So while it is important, fathers, not to provoke their children, it's even more important that they bring them up in this way. So you hear what I'm saying? Last week, and I think it's real important because last week, there was a lot of stuff there. And so it would be real easy to get bogged down in that and like, well, I've done this and I've done that. But this morning, we want to continue that pivot that we started last week, which is don't do this. And as we learned last week, it is stop doing that thing that you're doing. Rather, do the more important thing, which is how we bring them up. And Paul's saying, yes, it's important to stop parenting in a way that is not consistent with the character of Christ. But we don't stay there because it's important that you stop doing the wrong thing. But what's even more important is that we walk in the freedom of the right thing. So the structure there, even the way Paul's wording that, is teaching us a very important lesson. Don't get bogged down in the things we're doing wrong. Rather, pivot, turn, be hopeful toward that which is to come next, the right way of doing things. So that's exciting. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the second part of this, the what comes next. We're going to talk about the instead, the but, the rather, the more important thing that we turn and walk toward. And that is bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Bring them up. Doesn't quite do justice to the term. One thing I've learned is I really wish that I could somehow go back in time and spend about 5 years in the Greco-Roman culture and learn Greek. Because every time you read a word, you dig into it, and it's like, man, these guys must have just done nothing but talk all the time because, a lot of words. I'd like these people. I don't like these people. Lots of words. I am Greek from Sparta. Okay. Eldar, that's for you. Now we'll see. Now we're going to know if Mona and Eldar go back and live stream today or not. So we're going to find out. I plant these little things in there to see people come back and tell me, oh, I heard you make fun of me. Okay, I just make sure you're listening. The last time Paul used this same word, by the way, was in chapter 5, verse 29. Speaking to husbands, he says, after all, no one ever hated their own body, but they fed and cared for their body just as Christ does the church. So it's that feeding and that caring for in the same way that Christ does that for us. That's what's included because it's the same word in the Greek as the bring them up. So it's not just hang out with them till they get old. It's not just tag them along with you until they're able to go do their own thing. When Paul says bring them up, there is an encouragement toward nurturing and provision, not just for the physical need, but for the emotional and spiritual need of the whole child. It is in a way, feed them not just practically, but that's important, but emotionally and mentally and spiritually nourish and nurture them from where they are to where they're supposed to be going. Bring them up. It's not just the concept of throw a seed in the ground and see what happens. There is a nurturing that's involved. There's a feeding that's involved. There's a care that's involved. So when Paul talks about bring them up, it is all-encompassing, and he's speaking to not only the importance of what is to be done, but the value of the children that we are bringing up. See, bringing up children is not a haphazard, willy-nilly, just see what happens, wait 18 years and see what you got kind of venture. It is to be done intentionally, on purpose, with an end in mind. And that end is to be God-given. And then the process of getting from where you are to where you're going is a God-given in Christ, bring them up sort of process. And I think we need to hear that because it lets us know, again, the value that is to be placed on this process and the children that are involved in this process. So it means to nourish up, to nurture, to raise to maturity. In the context there, in the tense there, is something that is to be done on a continuing basis as the habitual part of life, and it doesn't stop at a certain age. The bring them up, there is implied in the way it is stated, an ongoing action. You don't stop bringing up your children when you have gray hair. You don't stop bringing up your children when you have no hair. I'm hoping for gray hair. I'm hoping to keep it long enough to turn gray. And let me tell you this. It doesn't stop when your children have gray or no hair. It's an ongoing generational continuity process. The elders meeting this week, one of the scriptures that came forth was from the Psalms, that one generation will commend his works to another. And that talking of the works of God from one generation to the other, to the other, to the other, is part of the bringing them up. It's a process that continues throughout the life of the parent and the child. And our culture gets this wrong. Before I skip ahead here. We have this idea. We'll talk about parents first. We have this idea that somehow if we just get our kids, to 18 or to 20, off our car insurance and no longer on our taxes, like these are the two goals, right? As if that's what Paul says. Train them up until they are, up in the off your taxes and off your car insurance in the Lord. Right? We have this idea, if we can get these like two major tasks accomplished, plus minus out of our house, then somehow we've fulfilled our duty as a parent. And that's culturally where things are, but that's biblically not true. And likewise, we have this idea of, well, now that they're out of the house, then they don't want my input, and I no longer have a voice into their life. And culturally, we see that played out, but that's not biblically true. And as children, somehow we have this idea that once we pay all of our own bills, that we no longer need anything from our parents' generation. And again, culturally, we try to walk that out, but biblically, that's not true. Now, I'm not suggesting that at 30 and 35 and 40 years of age, your parents should still be paying your bills. If that's the case, we've got some other problems on both sides. We'll talk about that in a small group somewhere, I'm sure. But let me just put it this way. In the last 2 or 3 years, my wife and my children and I have lived in her parents' basement, right? And in the same time frame, they ended up living at our house. So we have to be careful that we don't put these cultural rules out there and negate the power of what family life can look like. And we have to be careful as children that we don't somehow think we have reached even the age of maturity, right? I blew past that a decade ago, but I still have need of the wisdom and inputs of my parents. And for me as a child to somehow think I've outgrown the need of parental input and somehow I don't need that anymore is foolishness on my part. Because there's still something there for them to bring me up in. And parents, if somehow you are allowing the culture to silence your parental voice because you think you'll be nagging if you are involved in your children's life, let me just say this. There is input and there's nagging. Have a conversation about it. I'm not suggesting that you're allowed that it's appropriate to call up your 30-year-old, hey, you got on clean underwear today? You might get in a car wreck. You had your opportunity to train them up to wear clean underwear every day. Okay? So, but the culture is going to tell you, well, because you can't do that, then you shouldn't call them up and say, I was praying for you today, and this is what the Lord said. So I want to be clear what I'm saying and what I'm not. I'm not suggesting some sort of weird codependent relationship until everyone's dead. But I'm also not suggesting that we put up these artificial laws and rules and regulations to somehow shut out a parental flow of authority that can be beneficial to children. And I'll tell you what, that's important because at some point, this crazy thing happens and children begin to have that input back into their parents. And their children are allowed to call and say, hey, Dad, let me tell you what I heard when I was praying for you this morning. Because it's not just a one-way street. But as children and as parents, we have a responsibility to keep that street open in the Lord so that the process can continue like it should. Yet again, we cannot buy into the cultural lies that would try to hem us in and isolate us as a generation. Because we have a responsibility to walk not according to an American culture, but according to a Christian culture that says, make room for those younger than you, those older than you. There's a voice that they should have in your life and that you should have in their life, because that's part of what Paul's talking about, parents. Bring them up, continuing to do that. No nagging, though. Nagging's bad. But I'll tell you one thing, kids. My mom nags me sometimes. She's sitting over there, love her to death. She'll say things to me, and I thought, Mom, I'm a doctor with 2 children. I'm reasonably well adjusted. I went to residency. I worked 80-hour work weeks, 30 hours at a time. I know it's raining and it's January, but it's like 50 degrees outside. I can drive after dark. Right? It'll be okay. Right? But at some point, I just have to go, you know what? My mom loves me and is concerned for me, and it's okay. Oh, why am I saying this out loud in front of people? It's okay for her to express that to me. And I don't have to get all bent out of shape thinking my mom's telling me I don't have enough sense getting out of the rain. At the same time, Mother. No, we'll just let that go. I'm going to stay over here. I have been trained in the instruction and training of the Lord. I will let that go. Do you hear what I'm saying? Are we good? I'll preach that a 4th way if you want me to. I've lost myself in my notes because that wasn't in there. The obeying and honoring that is required of children and the bringing up that is required of parents, both of these are lifelong issues. Okay, let's do that. Training and instruction. Training, paideia. I put the phonetic phonetic pronunciation? Is that's called? Paideia, to see if I'm getting it right. So this is the word. It's translated in various versions: nurture, training, discipline, chastising. That's the first word. Bring them up in the paideia of the Lord. So what in the world is that? Read you some definitions. It means to provide instruction with the intent of forming proper habits of behavior, of providing guidance for responsible living, of rearing and guiding children toward maturity. But it's interesting, in the ancient Greek world, paideia actually was a much broader concept of not just education, but it was the term. It would almost like be saying democracy, right? We know that what a democracy is by definition, but it has a meaning in our culture, and it touches many different things. And you could say you would write a report in school. What does democracy mean to you? I mean, paideia was not just the subjects you took in school, though that was part of it. It was the things that happened outside of school. It was gymnastics and rest. It was Paideia was the concept of what it meant to take a Greek child and raise them up into the idealized, perfect citizen of Greece. It was everything that was required to teach them not just in what to think, but how to think. And not just facts, but what to do with them. It wasn't just from a didactic school type thing, but it was how you act at home and how you act at school and how you act at church and how you act when you're on the street. What does peer-to-peer relationships look like? And how do you go shopping? How do you carry yourself there? What is your, everything, what does it mean to be a Greek person? The idealized member of society. And so paideia was what it took to get from that infant sitting there, spitting on themselves and pooping on themselves to that fully functional, this is the idealized person. That's paideia. So when Paul says bring them up in the paideia of the Lord, it was more than just teach them a few things about God. It was how do we take this person and bring them up in every single aspect of cultural development to the maturity of who they are called to be in their place and function in society. So I want you to hear that when Paul says bring them up in the paideia of the Lord, he's talking about a multifaceted approach that is the entirety of the child. So it's a concept that his readers would fully understand. And he said, but I want you to do that in the Lord. So it's not a Greco-Roman culture, it's a Christian culture. And it's not necessarily strength of body, but it's strength of spirit. Right? So it's everything that Paul teaches about Jesus. He said, this is the idealized Christian. Now, paideia your children to that. So it leaves no stone unturned. It says everything is not just fair game, but everything's required as we do this. And it's interesting, do you know where Paul uses this word? It's not used a ton, but its highest density of use is in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through about 11. Let's go there. Let's just do that. Books, Bible. Let me read that real quick. I know I'm reading outside of Ephesians, but Pastor Jim's with the children. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, the paideia of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he paideias, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for the paideia that you endure. God deals with you as sons, for what son is there whom his father does not paideia? For if you are without it, all of you have become of which all of you have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, so that we may share in his holiness. And then listen to this. All discipline, all paideia, for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. NIV says painful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So I want you to see here what's happening. We talked several months ago about marriage relationships. And what we discovered is we could learn an awful lot about Christ and the church. We can learn an awful lot about us and Christ by studying that. So we've been reading here about children. And I've been trying to encourage you, don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep. And this is what Paul is doing here. Paul, we bring in Hebrews into this context, and he talks about the way that the Lord paideias us, the way he fathers us. And what he's doing, and he's saying, I want you to parent your children the way I've parented you. Do you see a little connection there in this concept of paideia? It's all, he said, Casey, you're a son. And I am training and disciplining, I am paideing you as a son. And it's not going to feel good in the moment. It's going to hurt sometimes because you've been raised by a culture that's not you, and I'm taking and knocking that off and forming up in who you are to bring you into the fullness of the son I've called you to be. And I'm going to father you in that process. And then he says to me as a father, now I want you to do that for your children. And I can tell you, it's not always fun. Who wakes up in the morning and goes, I get to be disciplined today? I mean, it's not, on your top 5 list. And let me just tell you this, kids. As a dad, it's hard being on that side of it too. And parents say the dumbest things. I do that. I got my book when I was a kid, Dumb Things You Have to Say, and we just, it's going to hurt me more than it hurts you, right? And we say that. And as a kid, you're like, well, if that's the case, well, how about you don't drive for a week and you don't talk to your friends and give me your cell phone if it's going to hurt you more than me? And I thought that would go over better. We're administering the rod to the children, right? And they're thinking, how does this hurt? I'm just telling you, it is not easy being a parent. And discipline, giving the discipline is difficult as well. But parents, let me just tell you, you are required by the Lord to paideia your children. And let me tell you, in this concept, when you dig into it, there is a punitive side of discipline. That's not the right word. There is a side of discipline that's going to hurt. There is a side of discipline that requires more than where you're at. There is a side of discipline, there is a side of paideia that is going to seem unpleasant to your child. As a parent, if your child is never uncomfortable because of your expectations of them, your expectations are too low. Because Paul says in Hebrews that this paideia will seem unpleasant and painful at the time, but afterwards produces the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And my daughter said to me yesterday, Dad, we're just studying, and talking. I said, I don't like to be disciplined. I said, I know. But do you like to eat the peaceful fruit of righteousness? And she sheepishly admits that, yeah, there's some benefits to love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. But do you see what I'm doing? I'm trying to tie yet again how, as parents, so often we feel like that we're our kids' buddies and friends, and one day you will be that with your friends. But you've got to walk through a process of paideia to get them there, just like the Lord is walking through that process with us. And as we talked about last week, what do you do when the situation's not ideal and you had a parental nincompoop? Let me just say this. Even if you had the worst or best dad, wherever you are on the scale, they are not perfect. Let's go to Hebrews 5 and realize we have a perfect father. And we have a perfect example. And so we must never forget that we are in that process with him. Because he loves us. And he wants to see us mature into who he's called us to be. And so we have this joyous privilege as fathers, as parents, to do this to and for our children. And again, this is a command. This is not optional. And some of you are saying right now, whoo, glad I don't have kids. To which, hold on. This is what I would say. It's coming. No, it's not coming fast enough. This is what I would say. You do have children. And there are those in your life that you are required to paideia, even if you did not give birth to them, ladies. Even if they are not your biological offspring, men. There are people in your life that you are called to paideia. You are called to see where they are and to see where they're supposed to be, where God's called them to be, and walk out a process that's going to be painful for both of you to get them there. Because you are a father and you are a mother, and there is a God-given responsibility and what God requires of us, He empowers us to do. And no, you can't do it on your own. So stop trying and realize that all of this, as we've discussed, is an outflow of life in Christ, life in the Spirit, life by the power of God. And you can't do this on your own. Okay, great. So that's paideia. What's left for nouthesia? We'll talk about it. Nouthesia literally comes from the word nous, which means mind, and tathemia, to mean to place or to put. That word literally means to put in the mind. It's interesting, though, the putting in the mind describes the exertion of an influence upon the mind to which the mind would be resistant. So basically what Paul is saying is you've got to put things in your kid's mind, and their mind is going to be resistant to what you're putting in there. So when you try to put something in there and it doesn't go very well, then you're heading the right track, probably. Literally, another way of saying this means to put in one's right mind. And I can think of a dad, how many times I look at my kid and go, have you lost your mind? You must be out of your mind. Biblically speaking, there actually is some truth to that. Yeah, they have lost their mind. They are out of their mind. But guess what? As a dad, what do I want to do in my flesh? I want to get frustrated. What are you thinking? You've lost your mind and you're out of your mind too. You know, I just think of so many things my kids have done. But then my mom's here and she'll tell you stories about me that I've been out of my mind. And as a parent, it's a perfect opportunity to, yes, your kids have lost their mind. They're out of their right mind. Now let's put them in their mind. Let's put things let's put their mind in the right order. Let's place in there the things of the Lord. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but you could look at paideia being the what we do and the nouthesia being what we say. But words are important. I am a firm believer of the philosopher who said that more is caught than taught. Your kids are watching what you do. They're watching your response to the Lord in your paideia journey. Better believe they're watching. But we must not just say our kids will see us and follow after us. We must also use our words. And I love St. Francis of Assisi, who said, I got a t-shirt actually. It said, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. And that's true. Parent your children at all times, and if necessary, use words. But there is a time for the use of words. And unfortunately, we will allow that concept to say, well, I'm just preaching the gospel at all times. And we forget the if necessary, use words part. And we forget that there is a time and a place for speaking out truth. And there's a time and place in parenting for speaking out truth. There is a nouthesia moment. There's an instruction moment that should come. Actually, there's lots of them, and they should come quite often. What we have to realize here is that our culture, again, wars against this. There's a thought out there, particularly, young people keep getting older because I got to stay young. But let's go from about 12 to 20. 12 to 25. Anybody in here, raise your hand. Right. Okay. I went to college. You know, it only took 3 years to get a 4-year degree because they didn't know much back then. That's how old I am. But there's this thing that happens to young people in our culture. Now, you need to learn to think for yourself. Who's been told you need to learn to think for yourself? Right? We've told that. There is some truth to that, but I want you to hear where I'm going with this. And as parents, we get told what? Your children need to think for themselves. And there's this lie, and we're just going to talk about this morning, that says that as a parent, for me to train my children about the Lord is to make them narrow-minded and to make them bigoted and to make them unable to think for themselves. And that as a parent, what I should do is to give them all the tools, spread it out like a buffet before them, and allow them to pick. Right? Who's heard this garbage? That somehow says to us as Christian parents, they see nouthesia to speak into the brain and set it on the right course, and they say, you are brainwashing your children. A really wise man once told me, we talked about this, and he said, you better believe I'm brainwashing my children. Their brains are dirty. They need to be washed. I wash my clothes when they get dirty. Nobody ever looks at me and said, Casey, you need to let your clothes choose for themselves. They just wanted to be dirty today. You know, that shirt that stinks and is all dirty, that's what it was meant to be. Allow that to discover itself. The dumbest thing I've ever heard of. So our children are born with a sin nature, a bend toward wrong. Our children are born with a malformed, dirty brain that just thinks toward itself. It's the most selfish. If our kids by themselves ever do the right thing by themselves, and the untrained brain, if they ever do the right thing, you just got to look for why that benefited them. I mean, they do something nice for their sister, and you're like, oh, there's something in the flesh beneficial for them. You know, I know this because I have 2 kids and I was once a kid. And I also tell you, on days when my flesh is particularly strong, my natural reaction is its natural reaction. Why do you think we have to walk daily in the supernatural power of Christ? Because we have a flesh and a brain that we must struggle to overcome. Because left toward itself is the most self-looking thing ever. The brain tends toward self-preservation. Now, we all know people who do dumb things that aren't self-preserving, but it's because their brain has gone from messed up to really messed up, and somehow they think the thing that is so self-defeating in the moment, they actually think that's what they need or want. And you look at that and go, you must be out of your mind. And what I'm telling you is in the flesh, they are not out of their mind. They are more in their own mind than they've ever been in their entire life. And you can get Paul talks about this, being left over, turned over to your own flesh, that you just get in a bigger and bigger mess. By yourself is a mess. So why would we say to our children, do what you want to do? Well, I know what they want to do. It's the wrong thing. We need to brainwash our children because our children's brains are dirty. And we are commanded to bring them up in the paideia and the nouthesia of the Lord. Let me just put it this way. If we don't train our children what is right, someone else will train them in what is wrong. And it should not be left to chance or to college to train our children. And you know what else? Where's Jared Boyd? Is he in here? No, but his wife is here. Great people. Great. They do this youth ministry. Mona's not here. Everybody I could talk about left. I don't know. But that's actually a perfect morning for this, right? This is talking to who? Mothers and fathers, right? It's not talking about, think about this morning, right? The youth pastor isn't here. Children's pastor isn't here. Senior pastor, he left too. You're stuck with me. It's a perfect time to say, it's okay that they're not here because it's ultimately not their responsibility to raise up our children anyway. It is ultimately our responsibility. And so I appreciate the youth pastor, the senior pastor, the children's pastor. I appreciate the help and augmentation that they bring to my duty. But it is my responsibility. And for those of you who have people the Lord has put in your life to paideia and to nouthesia, it is up to you to do that. And it is not okay to turn them over to a public school, private school. You know what? You can homeschool and not have this concept, by the way. You teach them to read, write, and do arithmetic, and you have no concept for the greater being that you're responsible for. You can homeschool them. You can just not even send them to school and miss it. And I'll tell you what, you can send them to youth, and you can send them to children's church, and you can send them to public school, you can send them to college at It and Carson Newman or online, and they'll be okay if you've done your job here. But if somehow you're going to send them out to the world system to get their brain put in the right place, it's not going to happen. If you're out of your mind before you go to school, you're going to be way bad out of your mind when you get back. And I'm not trying to overemphasize the mind. I understand that it is the paideia is not just the intellect, but it's the spiritual and emotional and physical well-being of the whole child. Do you take your 5-year-old into the grocery store and say, get something? Some of you do, actually. I had a lady, no, this is true. I had a lady in the office, the kid's 2, is a lot overweight, and I suggested they need to go to skim milk instead of a gallon every day of whole milk the kid's drinking. And the woman looks at me and says, I try to buy whole milk, but Johnny won't let me. Johnny's 2. And I verified, I checked his birth date. Johnny does not have a car or a job or a concealed weapon permit. How does Johnny keep you from buying skim milk? And everyone that can remember when their kids were 2 isn't laughing as loud as everybody else because they have felt controlled by Johnny. Oh, I'll tell you how Johnny does that. Yeah, I know who you are. You know who you are. And I'm giving you permission to buy skim milk. Our children require us to parent them. And the Lord demands of us to parent them. And it's not always easy for any of us, and that's okay. Death is seldom easy. This is a process of them dying to their self and me dying to myself, and in the end, we all die so that we live a life in Christ. So it's okay. And let me just suggest, you need to figure out how to keep your 2-year-old from controlling your life, because when they're 14, they're way better at controlling and manipulating than they were when they're 2. And again, I am not talking about creating little robots that just act and do it and everything. We're not talking about doing this in your own power. I'm not saying if you've got an 18-year-old that is a handful that you're a horrible person. Please don't hear what I'm not saying, because I will go back and preach all of Ephesians 1 through 5 that got us to this moment if you need me to. But this moment is about who we are in Christ, and it's being applied to who we are as parents in our home. And Paul is very clearly giving us some very specific things that we can do, and it all hinges on the very end, which is this. Let's go to make it even that. The training and instruction of the Lord. It all comes back to life in Christ. We need to know it so we can teach it. We've got to live it so we can teach it. It's got to be formal. It's got to be informal. It is life on life with our children and those that we're called to parent. When it's ugly and when it's pretty and when it's hard and when it's tough, it's every day, day in, day out. That's what it's called to be a godly parent. And it is not just done into the Lord, of the Lord, but it is done for Him, by Him, in Him, through Him, and without Him, it ain't happening. So if you arrive at this moment and you feel like there's no way you could do this by yourself, you have paid very good attention. Thank you. All right. I want to read a quote. This is from Albert Barnes, the Barnes Commentary. I have a feeling in 100 years, if somebody ever were to read something I wrote, it wouldn't sound quite this eloquent. But I love to read old stuff. They just have, somehow I think this thing is rotting my brain out, because these guys didn't have a cell phone, but they had just a way of saying things. I just love it. So this is Albert Barnes. To inculcate the truths of religion is not to make the mind narrow, prejudiced, and indisposed to perceive the truth. Religion makes the mind candid, conscientious, open to conviction, ready to follow the truth. Superstition, bigotry, infidelity, and all error and falsehood make the mind narrow and prejudiced. If a man does not teach his children truth, others will teach them error. Love that. It takes both nouthesia and paideia. Without it, parental instruction is incomplete. I'm going to leave you with this. We're going to go back to just super practical. So these are practical ideas for parents, practical outflows coming from these verses. So just what do you do? How do you put legs to this? Number one, Refuse to live through your children. Refuse vicarious living. It doesn't mean that you don't allow your children to learn from your mistakes, and it doesn't mean that you don't tell them about your life. But what it means is at some point you have to realize that we are raising children, a whole person, and they're not just miniature versions of yourself, and that's okay. You may have been one step away from the Super Bowl. That doesn't mean that your daughter needs to play football. Doesn't mean that she shouldn't. I'm just saying. Sorry. As a bunny trail, I didn't go down. I'm proud of me. Number 2, avoiding unhealthy pressure or unhealthy expectations. It's a balance that we have to learn as parents. I can't expect myself to be perfect, yet my goal is to achieve perfection. I want to be like Christ, who is perfect, yet I know in and of myself I can never do it. We have to teach our children how to live out a life that says I'm not perfect, but I'm being perfected. To never settle, but never strive. To always go for what's next, but yet be comfortable with where you are. We have to teach our children that there's more to them than they realize, but that they themselves are a sufficient version of them, and that we love them for who they are, yet calling them up to a standard of who they're called to be. That's tough. Reject jealousy and contempt. Refuse to put down, demean, or damage them. Attend to their material and emotional needs. Dads, it's not enough to put a roof over their head. Provide experience, especially in work and in caring for others. These kind of tie together. Remember, part of your paideia is to get your children outside of themselves. The ability to serve others and the ability to care for others and the ability to see life from someone else's perspective is phenomenal. At some point, take your children on a mission trip. It doesn't have to be to Africa. It just has to be, it can be next door. It can be taking a meal to a shut-in that lives next door. It can be mowing the grass of someone who can't. But at some point, we have to train our children towards something. Grant freedom with legitimate boundaries. Create a context of grace, love, support, respect, and encouragement. See, this is what you do when you want to have a top 10 list, but you got like 50 things, you just put commas. This actually is a list that comes from the commentary that I have just fallen in love with over the last year. And I wanted to share these with you. Always speak the truth in love. And finally, give a theology of life in Christ. They're just practical things. I know you look at those and go, okay, well, how do you do that? There's a small group near you. There's a parenting conference coming up. We're going to unpack some of this stuff. The single best way to do these things for your children is to live them in your own life. Worship team, if you would come. I'll leave that slide up there for a bit. But take a picture of it. Don't write it all down yet. We've got a couple more important things to go through. So this is great. So this commentary gave this huge list, talked about them. It was awesome. I was somewhere between like challenge and in tears and like retrospective and introspective and trying, all those things you do when we have these type teachings. And then I love what he says next. All this takes time, communication skill, and discipline. I was good till discipline, because in the end, it is about our discipline as parents. We have to walk to and through with the Lord before we'll ever be able to be the parents we're called to be. We've got to be willing to embrace that process for ourselves. We've got to realize that just because it hurts doesn't mean we have to stop. We have to realize that just because our mind is resistant to the things of Christ, it doesn't mean that we stop. It means we push through the resistance and put the things of Christ in our mind and in our heart. Because we need the peaceful fruit of righteousness in our life. And we can't somehow try to paint the fruit of righteousness on us and try to skip the step of it being born in us. It's the message that we've gone through so many times in Ephesians. So this is my quote, perhaps not quite as eloquent, but I'll tell you anyway. Parenting is an intense, invasive, time-consuming, life-consuming, interactive, all-encompassing journey that requires more of you than you have to give. It's one of the hardest things you could ever do. God has placed a lot on us as parents, a weight that we would be ill-advised to carry on our own. Parenting must be intentional. Our children are never to be an afterthought. We should be proactive and not reactive as parents. It is about our life with Christ touching the life of another that God has put in our care to raise up in the paideia and the nouthesia of the Lord. Stand with me.